Hi guys, welcome to the Cambridge Creatives Q&A with Basu. I'm Hannah.
And I'm Sasha. Thank you for supporting Cambridge Creatives. We are a student-run creative collective and we are curating a series of talks with world-renowned professionals in film, TV and theatre. So please follow our Facebook page to find out more about future events. And just a couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, please type them into the Q&A function, not the chat, and we will read them out for you. Bear with us if there are any technical difficulties and let us know in the chat if there are any problems hearing or seeing us, and enjoy the Q&A.
So just a little introduction for our guest today. Jay started out as a novelist before becoming a screenwriter. His first film, Song of Songs, co-written with Josh Appignanesi, won special commendation for Best British Film at the Edinburgh Film Festival, allowing him to become a full-time screenwriter. He's most known for his work on The Girl in the Spider's Web and Fast Girls, and we are really honoured to have this impressive screenwriter speak today. So my first question for you, Jay, is when did you know that you wanted to be a writer, whether that was novels or on screen?
Well, first of all, hello everyone. Greetings from Los Angeles. I hope everyone is safe and well and not going too crazy. And I'm very happy to be talking to you guys. When did I first know I wanted to be a writer? It's something that I think I was lucky enough to know for quite a long time as a kid. You know, I had two great loves. One was visual art and still is. You know, I drew and I still draw and I love graphic art. And then the other was sort of literature and writing. I grew up in a little terrace house in East London full of books. You know, I have two slightly wacky hippie parents who kind of brought me up surrounded by books and art and music. And so that was sort of in my blood, and films too. And so that was in my blood from a very early age. And I loved writing. I think what happened was, you know, before I went to Cambridge, I had to make a choice. I mean, there was a moment where I had to say, well, am I going to go to art school? Am I going to follow this kind of interest in visual art? Or am I going to sort of follow the literary writing route? And I decided that although I'm a good visual artist, I maybe wasn't quite good enough. maybe I would have to put too much effort into building a life as a visual artist. So, you know, I decided to follow the literary route, and then I was writing at Cambridge. I mean, we can talk a bit about that, I'm sure, but yeah, I knew from an early age, and it's interesting because I started as a novelist, but and we can also talk about that sort of transition. But I think now that really screenplay and film, you know, it's a great combination. It's like an amalgam of those two interests. You know, it's obviously it's a literary, you know, it's about writing, it's about being able to put words on a page, but it's also about the kind of visual language, and you have to think in a very visual grammar, and you're always trying to construct your stories visually. And so for me, I feel like, okay, I'm in the right place in that I'm sort of combining these two things that I at one point thought I had to sort of split apart, and I found a kind of way to combine them, I think. But yeah, I've known for a long time that I wanted to write, and I wrote for a long time, you know, since I was a kid, really.
So you've spoken about how Cambridge was kind of this strategic choice over art school. How involved were you in writing at Cambridge? Were you involved in theatre or film, or was it more of like you wanted to be a novelist?
I was involved in film in that I ran the King's College Film Club, which you've just reminded me about, that I'd forgotten about. We had two rickety old 16 millimeter projectors that you literally had to stick a pencil in one of them so it would work. And me and my friends took over the running of the King. I'm sure King's College now has like super high-end video projectors, but at the time, 20 years ago or whenever it was, you know, we had these like ramshackle little projectors. And we started running the film club, and I would actually make posters for the films. So I was indulging that kind of graphic, that lower graphic stuff. But I did write, you know, the thing that actually changed things for me and actually, I think, propelled me as a novelist, a couple of things. One was many people that have been influences on my life, and in fact, one of my first collaborators in film Josh Appignanesi, who you mentioned, you know, he was at Cambridge. He was a year or two above me at Cambridge. And there was a kind of group of people at the time who were creators and writers. I mean, Zadie Smith has been a friend of mine for many, many years. And I think she was 1 or 2 years above me. But, you know, we saw her, and, you know, obviously she became such a gigantic success and such a fantastic writer. And she's been part of my life for a long time. And so there was a group of people a sort of soup of people that was inspirational for me, inspiring to also my wife, who I have been with for many years. I met at Cambridge, and she's an artist. And so there was a kind of a creative atmosphere that I think influenced me. And then what happened is I wrote a short story while I was there that got published in the May anthologies. Do you still have the May anthologies? I presume you do.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Well, that was a really important thing for me, you know, because I had a story published in the May anthologies. It was about something that happened to me in India. My father is Indian, and something that happened to me as a kid when I was in India. I wrote about it in a short story. And what happened actually is, at the launch of the May anthologies, perhaps the 1999 May anthology or something. God, I'm old. But at that launch, I remember two things about it. One, I had to read my story, and I hadn't prepared properly. I was like overconfident. I hadn't prepared. I didn't have water, and I choked. I did a terrible reading, and I'm like, and I promised myself that I would never do a bad reading again. And I think that's true. I think I managed to stick to that. So that stayed with me. And then the other thing that happened, though, is that in the sort of bit where everyone was, you know, drinking their wine and eating their canapes, a literary agent, approached me, a woman called Isabel Dixon, and said, "Are you writing a novel?" And I lied and said yes. But that lie was actually turned out to be, you know, one of the most important lies that I ever told, because it made me think seriously about what would be the novel that I'd want to write, and made me seriously think about doing that and dedicating myself to that. And that's what I did after I graduated. And so that really put me on the path to being a novelist. So, you know, yes, I mean, we can talk more about all of that, but yes, to answer your question, you know, Cambridge, there was a kind of atmosphere in Cambridge, and I certainly wrote in Cambridge, and all of that was very influential on my career, I think, as a writer.
So when you left uni, did you go straight into writing your novel, and how did you eventually sort of transition into film?
Yes, when I left Cambridge, I went very quickly into writing a novel. At the time, I was spending a lot of time with because my dad is Indian and my mom is half Russian Jew, half Polish Catholic. So I'm a Hindu Catholic Jew, as I like to say. Very confusing thing to be. But I was spending a lot of time with my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, Polish grandfather, and being quite inspired by his life and very interested in his life. And that became the sort of kernel for a novel that I wanted to write. And so I started working on that. I can't even remember, maybe before I even graduated, but certainly I was working on it, you know, just after I graduated. And I was living in this little flat in Covent Garden, this little rent-controlled flat. I had a roof over my head, but I had no money, and it was a kind of, I remember it being, you know, it was a tricky decision. It was like it was a leap in the dark that I was going to dedicate my life to, or some part of my life to writing something without any knowledge of how it would go. But, you know, I was lucky to have a roof over my head. I took a job. I was teaching for a little while. So I was teaching English as a second language. And that was sort of paying my bills for a little while. And then as I worked on that novel. And really what happened was, that novel sort of, it came out of me, the way I remember it, I'm sure it's much harder than I remember it, but I remember it kind of flowing quite in a kind of burst of energy over probably a year or so. And, you know, and then I literally approached two agents. One was Isabel, the woman who had approached me at the May anthologies, and the other was a guy called David Godwin, who's quite a well-known agent. And the only reason why I approached him is his office was underneath the flat where I used to live. So I thought, well, he sounds like a good guy, let me give it to him. And it was his son, actually, who I have to thank, Sebastian Godwin, who's himself a filmmaker now and has become a friend. But he read the manuscript and liked it and gave it to his dad. And David Godwin simply replied quicker than Isabel Dixon. And so I signed with David Godwin. And we got it published. You know, it got published pretty swiftly with Jonathan Cape. And so it really felt like, okay, this is easy. This is my life. And, you know, it got published in America and in a few languages. And, you know, it's not that it's sold amazingly well, but it was well received. And it made me, you know, enough money that I could live off it for a couple of years, actually, roughly, with little bits of, you know, other work here and there. But it sort of set me on my way. And I thought, well, this is, you know, I'm going to be a novelist now. And then what happened is I struggled monumentally to write another novel. I mean, I was 22 years old, 21, 22. And it became very overburdened to try and figure out, you know, I had sort of difficult second album quandaries. And so, you know, I was struggling to find what the second novel would be. I had a few false starts. And in that time where it was becoming kind of, I wasn't having much fun creating, Josh Appignanesi, who I had known at Cambridge, I hadn't been huge friends with him, but I became much more friendly with him after I graduated. He was in the British film industry, which we can talk about the sort of British film industry, but the process is often that you have to kind of spend some time developing things and doing various different kind of courses and development programs and so on. And Josh was in that mode. He'd made some short films. He was very frustrated that he hadn't been able to get a feature together. And he'd come up with some private funding. He'd managed to get some private funding, not much, but enough to make a low, you know, micro budget movie. And he literally said to me, look, you write things, you know, let's do something, let's collaborate on something. And that became a film called Song of Songs. And, you know, we worked together on that. And really with the similar spirit to which I wrote the novel, which is like, well, I didn't know how hard it was yet. And so we just did it, you know, and it became a film. You know, we didn't even really have a proper script. We had a kind of, because in many ways it's an experimental film in some ways, that movie. I mean, it's certainly a kind of unorthodox movie in some ways. But we had a sort of 40-page document that became the film and so on. But what that did is it really, you know, and I have to thank Josh for really showing me the ropes of screenplay and screenwriting. And I found that, and I went off and read Sid Field's book, Screenplay, which is a kind of a classic, you know, a sort of standard book. I mean, it's a very reductionist, ridiculous, but it's the kind of book where it's like, if you feel like someone is chomping on a big cigar and saying, it's easy, you just get 90 pages and you do this and you do this and you got a movie. But it's a very helpful book in terms of breaking down how the sort of 3-act structure works that I still use today, and many of my colleagues and people that I work with still think in those terms, very much so, in terms of structure. So I read that book and I found that I really enjoyed the film industry. I was having fun again. I was creating again, and I was also not going mad alone in the room, you know, for large periods of time trying to write a novel. I was sort of going mad with other people in a very collaborative way. And I really enjoyed the dynamism of that. And I found that I really also enjoyed the form of the screenplay. It's a very kind of, it's very structural, it's a very particular form, and it's quite beautiful once you start unfolding the way a screenplay works and the way narrative and dramaturgy works. And so that became my life, that became my career. And I found that, you know, it sort of developed through Song of Songs. Song of Songs did okay, you know, it did quite well in the festival circuits and won prizes. And there was enough there was a hook to that story that I think it pulled people in. And we were able to get really good actors and really good cast. And so that put me around people who are making films, and that kind of started me off really in the film. And it was something I found that I really was enjoying doing, and now that's what I do. Yeah.
Well, you sound like Sorry, you
alongside.
sound like you've had a very unorthodox route into the industry, or even learning how to do it. So do you have any tips for students who would like to follow in your footsteps, whether that's with being a novelist or going into screenwriting? Like, do you believe that film school is a good idea, or just doing and then learning by books like you did?
Yeah. Well, first of all, look, I think every single screenwriter that I know and filmmaker that I know has had a quote unorthodox entry into the thing. You know, there isn't really, although it is true to say, of course, there are sort of more tried and tested routes, and they do exist. And, you know, in England, it's perhaps, you know, getting into a BBC writer's workshop or some kind of development process. And certainly I did those things. I mean, I had to do, you know, I was involved for some years in the kind of development scene in the British film industry and trying to get things made and trying to get things seen. So I do think those are, you know, and in the US, there's perhaps more orthodox routes where, you know, you might even start as a writer's assistant, or, I mean, certainly in television in America, it's a little bit more of a programmed route, I think. But almost everyone, when you get down to it, kind of falls into it in various different ways. And I think I don't know, I mean, I feel like, and of course I entered I broke into the industry. Oh, I just broke my chair. I broke into the industry 20 years ago, you know, so it's probably a little different now. But I think what the similarities that I can see in terms of people's breaking in stories is always that you have to be at some point, at some level, a kind of self-starter. That if you, by doing, is really by doing it, by writing, by producing good stuff, by putting yourself out there as a creator and as a writer, and then forming relationships, really that's the way you break into the industry. And I think that, and part of that is getting good. A big part of that is just getting good. You know, there is always a hunger. I mean, if you're talking about screenwriting specifically, there is always a hunger. Now, you know, I'm slightly on the other side and have, you know, been more of a producer on certain things and seen that happen. There is always just a hunger for good work, for great scripts. And so if you can write a great script, then it's about being able to get that great script read. But it doesn't matter unless the script's great, you know. And if it is great, doors will be opened for you. You know, you will have the opportunity to write something else, you know. And so what I would say is this. I would say film school is great. It is by no means necessary. And I would say a large proportion of filmmakers that I know and work with did not go to film school. But what I think film school is great for is putting you around people who are making films, putting you around people, and I'm talking about people in your peer group. You know, I think sometimes there's too much of for young writers and young filmmakers, there's a bit too much of a sense that if I can only get my film to this established producer, director, executive, whoever, I think much more often than not, it's the people that you come up with who are around you, who are hungry to make things, who are going to help you the most. And so I think really what film school is good for is putting you in a community of people who are making films. Because I think sometimes screenwriters make the young screenwriters think that, well, I just need to sit alone in my room and write a great screenplay. And it's not, it doesn't work like that, because the film industry is such a collaborative thing. And, you know, filmmaking is so collaborative. And so you need to be around people who want to produce things, people who want to direct things, other people who want to write things. And film school is a great way to do that, but it's not the only way to do that. You know, and the route that I took, it was a route that put me around people who are making films. And really that's what broke me into the industry. Ultimately, it was forming relationships, being able to put myself out as a writer, as a creator, to other people who were around me who had a hunger to make things. And so I think, you know, now, if anything, now more than ever, that is the important, you know, we're in an era now where you can be more of a self-starter, perhaps more than ever before. You know, I mean, when I was coming up, it wasn't possible for you to make your own short film and put it on YouTube or put it on a streaming platform and have people see it. And now it is. And, you know, I've seen myself, even in Hollywood, even in the sort of establishment of a studio, now young directors and young writers are coming up because literally a cool thing they made on YouTube has gotten to an executive or gotten to a producer. And so I feel like film school's great. You can learn on the job. You don't need film school, but film school's great in terms of putting you around, putting you into a community. So I would say, if you're not going to film school, put yourself in that community. Find them online, find them in your friendship groups, find other people hungry to make films, you know. And, you know, the last word on this is, if you look at all the great filmmakers, you know, especially those who work on sort of films that many, many people see, they always, and also, I mean, I love sort of mainstream big genre movies, but I also love Bel Artar movies and Andrei Tarkovsky movies and experimental movies. But whoever you are, the great filmmakers usually have a team of people, a close-knit team of people that they have worked with for a long, long time, you know, and that's because they came up together. They found a community of people, they found collaborators who were important to them, and those people, those little groups, a film isn't made by one person, it's made by a team of people. So if you can find your team, find your group, find your collaborators, that's one of the most important things I think you can do as a young filmmaker.
And how does that kind of vary from writing a novel? Like, for instance, when you, with advice for like coming up as a new novelist, obviously that can be a bit more of a solitary kind of practice. Yeah. So how would you say, what advice would you have to people to kind of approach publishing houses kind of differently to how they'd approach screenwriters and that kind of thing?
It's difficult. It's slightly difficult for me. I do have a friend right now who's starting off as a novelist, and so it's been interesting seeing her and her journey. I think maybe the publishing industry is slightly different than it was when I published, because I feel like, you know, I was still publishing in a time, and for example, we talk about Zadie and White Teeth, you know, that was still at a time where huge advances were something that a young writer could get. And not that I had a huge advance, but I had a decent enough, you know, I was able to make enough money from publishing a novel that it kind of sustained me for a while. I think that's harder and harder. From what I understand, it's harder and harder now in the literary scene, and there are less and less of those kind of deals. And so I think from what I see, perhaps even as a novelist, you have to be a little more inclined to promote yourself. You know, you have to be a little bit more inclined to be able to use social media, to use different platforms, to be clever, to be a kind of entrepreneur about what you're doing, and think about what your identity is as a writer. So I have observed that. I can't speak to first-hand experience of that because I haven't been in the publishing industry for so long. But my feeling is, as a novelist, look, if you want to write a novel, and I say this for all writers, but I think the fundamental thing really is, if anything can stop you doing it, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. I mean, it sounds harsh, but it is a solitary experience. But all the novel writers that I know do it because they need to. They feel like there is something that they want to say and something that needs to be expressed in that format, and it comes from a place of love for what they're doing, and the feeling that there is. You know, and it's the same for screenwriting too, but I think sometimes I have seen young writers fall into what I see the trap as feeling like they're in love with the idea of being a writer rather than the reality of being a writer. And I think that it's a good question to ask yourself at the beginning of your career. Am I doing this because I want to be a writer? Or am I doing this because I feel like there is something I need to write? I feel like there's something that I need to express. And I think it can be a hard question to ask yourself, but a helpful one, because certainly I think being a novelist, it's a tough road if you're thinking about it in terms of a career. If you're thinking in terms of, I have something that I want to express, and that's certainly how I felt, I can say I felt when I wrote my novel, I think you're going to be set up in the best way possible. And then it's going to be about the practical moves that you can make to get this thing seen and get this thing, you know, help a publishing house too. But in the same way, exactly the same way as I said for you know, the film industry, there is always a hunger for good writing. And a literary agent is always hungry to see a great novel. It's always hungry to read a manuscript that stands out. And so really, so much of it is about getting to the place where you're good. And that means you're going to write stuff that's not good, first of all. And you're going to have stuff that needs to be put in a drawer and never shown to the world again because it's hideous. But that's how you learn, and that's how you progress as a writer. And so I think putting in the work, putting in understanding that it's a process, and understanding that it's about getting good at what you do, and that there's a craft element as well as an inspiration element, is important both for novel writing and for screenplay. And then I think it's about, and then I think if you can get to that place, you know, I would say most of the people watching this, I presume, are Cambridge grads or Cambridge undergrads. You may already have the people that you need to show that can open a door for you. You probably already have those people in your life. The question is, are you going to be able to give them something good? And so that is what I think the mentality should be. You know, it should be, how do I write something, rather than like thinking of the practical, how do I get an agent? It's more like, how can I write something that is an expression that I feel proud of, and I feel is of a quality that people will be interested in. I mean, that's a very basic, in some ways, very basic answer, but you know, and then the realities of the publishing industry. Yes, I think you have to be more of a self-starter than ever before. I think you have to be prepared to publicize yourself, your work, and that can be difficult, especially for novelists who tend to be quite introverted. We're all pretty introverted as writers, but I think novelists are usually even more introverted than filmmakers. So, but you have to know that it's harder than ever, I think, to build a career. I mean, to be brutally honest about it. And so, you know, be prepared to do whatever you need to do to kind of open those doors. But it all starts with the work. It all starts with the work, you know. And I think you're better off thinking about the work than thinking about all of the strategies and you know, the sort of the idealized versions of what a writer is. Just do the work.
And once you've kind of like broken into the industry, done the work, and then leading on to the writing process, you kind of spoke a bit earlier about different genres and choosing between them. You've written films for like a variety of genres, and has there been a reason why you haven't, you know, just stuck to one? And would you kind of more closely stick to one genre in the future, or is there something that you enjoy about writing for a whole different variety?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you're right, I have ended up writing on a very sort of wide array of different genres. And I think on the surface, sometimes it looks like they're pretty disparate and there's not many kind of similarities. But actually, I feel like whatever I end up working on, there are similarities, at least to me, that kind of unify them. And there are certain things that I just don't do, and certain things, not that I don't like. You know, for example, I love comedies, but I will never write a broad comedy. It's not my skill set. It's not what I'm drawn towards. On a practical level, I'm drawn towards it, you know, in terms of watching great comedies, but I won't ever work on them, I don't think. So, but, you know, for me, what unifies, first of all, there's a few answers to that question. First of all, you know, for me, what unifies what I do is I have a great interest in worlds, in the specificity of worlds. So I tend to fall in love with a world and then want to find a kind of human story within that world. So I just worked on a Battlestar Galactica project for Universal, for Francis Lawrence, and, you know, so I've worked on big science fiction things, and then I've also, you know, I'm writing a small character drama about, you know, a female athlete and Fast Girls, for example. But if you take, let's say you take Battlestar Galactica and you take Fast Girls, what unifies them for me is that they're both these very specific worlds that I could dive into, and that I could find in those worlds a very human story. And that's what always attracts me. So, but what I will say is this: I think I've been able to, let's say, work towards this place where I'm able to work in different genres. I think it is true in the industry, especially in the film industry, that when you're beginning, people like to put you in boxes. It's just how executives think. It's how studio people think. It's how producers and production companies think. And, you know, there are many, many people who want to do what we do. And so, and there's a kind of sea of talent out there. And so for producers and people like that and executives, it helps them to be able to say, oh, this is she does this kind of stuff. He does this kind of stuff, right? So I think it is worth thinking when you're starting out about what is the genre, what is the area that kind of attracts you the most. When I started out, the first things that I wrote after Song of Songs, the first thing that happened was that in fact, it was again at a party. If we're learning anything, it's that half of my career is because of parties. But it was at a party that I met a producer. It was at a party at the Edinburgh Film Festival after Song of Songs was shown there. I met a producer who had the rights to a book, which was a book by Ted Lewis. Ted Lewis wrote Get Carter. He's a great and I think quite criminally forgotten British crime writer from the 1960s. And he had the rights to this Ted Lewis book and was sort of like, well, you know, again, it was one of those conversations. You write things, maybe you can see a movie in this book. And I fell in love with the book and I did see a movie in there. And that ultimately became the script that sort of broke me more sort of significantly into the industry as a writer. It's a kind of existential gangster film. It's a script that's nearly was made 3 or 4 times, and I still love that script. And so that became actually the genre that I worked with for a while, the sort of crime genre, sort of character-driven, but crime thriller. And actually off the back of that, my first job, which was a sort of an American job, it wasn't a big studio job yet, but it was for an American producer, again, was a crime thriller. And so that, I started off, you know, working in an identifiable genre, I suppose, you know, which was that kind of crime drama. And then, but what happened for me is, you know, the thing that's just true is once you've managed to establish yourself a little bit, it's true that you're only ever one project away or one script away from redefining yourself. You know, and it happens in people's careers, you'll see people, I mean, Craig Mazin talks about this, who wrote Chernobyl, but like previously wrote, you know, the Hangover films, you know, but he had this great desire to, you know, he had this great love of a very different kind of film, very different kind of genre of film. And you're only one project away from redefining where you are, as I said. So, you know, if you're writing crime dramas and people know you for that, but then you write a fantastic romantic comedy, let's say, then people will start to see you as a romantic comedy writer too. So you can pivot and you can do that. But I would say at the beginning of your career, it is an idea to find a genre that speaks to you, and think about that as a kind of I hate to use the word, but a kind of brand for yourself, right? A kind of identity for yourself. I mean, I'm sorry to speak in such crude terms, but at least as an identity for yourself as a creator, because it just is a truth that the industry works that way. The last thing I would say about that is there is an old adage, which is write what you know. And I have always said that, you know, I've always said to people that I think the much better way of thinking about it is write what you love. Write what you love. Because I see too many young writers who write, let's say, a romantic comedy or a horror film or whatever it might be, a thriller, because they think that that's what they should write. Because they think they think the market is interested in horror movies, so I'm going to write a horror film. It's similar to what I was saying about be in love with writing, don't be in love with the idea of being a writer, you know, because you almost always are going to flounder if you're writing something because you think you should write it. If you want to write genre films, write a genre that you love, right? Write a genre that you would pay whatever it is now, 10 quid or 15 quid or whatever it is now, to go and sit in the dark and, you know, take time out of your day and go and watch. Write those films, whatever it is, even if you think it's the most uncommercial genre, even if it's a extreme art house movie, great. If it's good, it's good. And if it comes from love, it's going to be much more likely to be good than if you're straining to write something that you feel you should write, if that makes sense. So that's my advice about genre and finding a genre. Yeah.
And I guess further into now in your career, you've started doing script doctoring. So I guess one of my main questions on that would be, does it work, like how close are you to the original concept and the director when you come in as a script doctor? And do you find that it works better when you're further removed and can kind of have a more objective view of the script, or when you're kind of closer to it and really understand what the director's trying to achieve or what the original scriptwriter's trying to achieve?
Yes, well, first of all, I mean, script doctoring, I know it's a term that I have used just as a sort of shorthand, but it's not really, you don't really say script doctor. It's a kind of a, it's a sort of a little bit of a misnomer as a term. What it's known as, that kind of writing is known as production rewrites. It's something that I just started, and it's a very specific kind of writing. And usually what you're doing in that sense, I mean, there's rewriting, which I have done many rewrites, and what rewriting tends to be is there's a script that's been developed, maybe there's a director attached, and there's the feeling that the script needs work and it needs to be taken to another place. And so you're brought in, or a writer is brought in to make those changes. So that's rewriting. Specifically, what people think of as script doctoring a lot of the time, which is production rewrites, is usually a slightly different scenario where a film is often going into production or in production, and there are problems with the script, and they bring a writer in to fix those problems, or try and fix those problems. And in that situation, it's slightly different because, you know, we were talking about a film as a collaborative thing. Often what you get in that kind of situation is you have the director wants it to be one thing, the producer wants it to be another thing, the actor wants it to be another thing. There's tensions going on. And so as a person who's trying to, and the studio wants it to be another thing, I mean, let's not forget the studio in that equation. So what you're trying to do as a writer is you're trying to, yes, fix the problems with the script, but you're also trying often to guide the story through all of this kind of sometimes dysfunctional relationship stuff that's going on, you know. And this, by the way, is why great scripts can often turn into bad movies, because there's so many elements in this mix that it's very easy, especially if there's not, people are not aligned in that process, that things can go wildly astray. And so what you're trying to do is fix problems in the script, but you're also trying to do it in this highly pressurized environment of, you know, pleasing, you know, finding a way to please and bring everyone onto the same side. So it's kind of that particular kind of writing is a particular thing, and it's not just about sitting alone in your room and writing. It's also about understanding the dynamics of the team and understanding what's required in order to get to the film to the place where it, you know, it can be shot in a happier way. Sometimes there's different aspects. Sometimes, you know, and I don't do this work, but sometimes people will be brought on, just, we need it funnier. It needs to be funnier. We need to punch up the dialogue. They're very specific. You know, I've been brought on to rework the third act. You know, the script's basically fine, but we want to change the third act pretty fundamentally. But that's very surgical. But we don't want to do that and change all of this stuff that we have in the first and second act. So you have to kind of work out the kind of mathematical problem of how you're going to make the changes that you need to make without. So there are different kind of tasks and different kind of, you know, it really depends on what the motivation for bringing in a writer is and what the task kind of at hand is. But really, yes, when we talk about script doctoring, you're usually talking about these production rewrites, and that's usually not just about writing, it's also about understanding what's going on in this family of filmmakers who are trying to get something made. So it's a very specific thing. And the people who do it at a very high level, the people who are very experienced at it, are paid incredible amounts of money to do that job. And the reason is because it's such a high pressure and specific and particular job to do, and it's kind of its own, in a way it's its own stream of screenwriting, in a way, working on production rewrites. So yeah, but that's the reality of that kind of work.
I was going to say it sounds incredibly stressful.
Yes, it can be.
You've spoken about how you were involved in that process for Charlie's Angels. Could you sort of give an insight into what that was like and how you solved it, or is that all hush hush?
Sure, I can talk a bit about it. I mean, yeah, there were many writers on Charlie's Angels. I was brought in as they were trying to push the movie into green light at the studio at Sony. So it was really about being able to come in and make surgical changes that will allow that project to get made, and we were able to do that. The reason that happened for me was a couple of reasons. I had worked with Elizabeth Banks before. I'd written Elizabeth Banks is the directed Charlie's Angels, the new Charlie's Angels. I'd worked with her on a kind of adaptation. I'd written an adaptation for her of a YA book that came close to getting made at Universal, and then Elizabeth went off. Actually, I think she went off to make Charlie's Angels. But I had a good relationship with her, and she has very particular ideas about what she wants, and as every director should. And it was because her, and also one of the producers, Elizabeth Cantillon, I'd also just worked with her on sWeb. So I had this relationship with the filmmakers, and they were in this position where, in fact, that was when I was alluding to rewriting a third act. That was what really had to happen with Charlie's Angels. They knew that they had a lot that was in place, but they knew that they wanted to quite significantly shift the bad guy, the antagonist in the movie, and they wanted his story to play out in a different way than what they had in the script. And so, because I had a relationship with them, I came in and was able to, and there was a very truncated period of time in which we had to do this, and it had to, it had to hit a certain deadline for the studio. So were they going to greenlight it or not greenlight it, et cetera, et cetera. So it was coming in that pressurized environment, and being able to listen to the studio, being able to listen to Elizabeth, being able to listen to the producers, and find a way to address these issues and sort of turn around the third act of the movie. So that's what I was really brought in to do. But there were many writers on that movie. I mean, sometimes that's what happens, that many writers come in, and it's kind of, you find a way. And in the end, I think it was Elizabeth got the credit on that movie because it was her. She was the one that was kind of managing, I think, all through this process, the ultimate story. I mean, credit, often when you come in and do production rewrites, it's not about credit. You don't end up getting the credit. What you're doing is trying to help people and trying to help the situation as best you can. But yeah, that's why that happened. And that was, a lot of it was about figuring out the antagonist story in that film and doing it in a surgical way so that everything else didn't fall apart. And but yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a good experience, and I'm glad to say we managed to get the film made, which is good, which is always good. If I hadn't, then wouldn't have been a good result for me.
Indeed. How, moving from sort of one female action film to another, how did you become involved in Fast Girls, and sort of how much research was needed in order to sort of flesh out these characters and make them seem whole rather than just sort of these stereotype athletes?
Yeah, well, Fast Girls happened because, Fast Girls came to me because I knew Noel Clarke. And I mean, I don't know, I'm sure you guys know Noel Clarke, sort of Renaissance man of the British film industry in a way. He's like a actor, writer, director, producer, entrepreneur guy, kind of a great, he's full of ideas, full of energy. And I had met Noel through a guy called writer-director called Mark Tonderai. And again, I mean, if we're talking again, if there's a lesson here, it's really about the importance of relationships, the importance of collaborations, because, I'd known Mark for a while. I knew him when he was a struggling writer-director. I knew him through the sort of London film. It was, in fact, Film London, which had various schemes that I was involved with that Mark was part of. And Mark then made a film, it's worth kind of hunting down, called Hush, which was a kind of horror thriller, which was a very nicely made and very kind of tight horror thriller that Mark made, that got him a lot of attention here. Now Mark is a makes a lot of high-end television and is a very established director. But I knew him from back in the day, and he was friends with Noel, and Noel and I hit it off. I think I really liked Noel's kind of and like his chutzpah, he's always got, as I said, a lot of ideas. And so we were sort of going back and forth and trying to figure out some collaboration that we could do. I mean, look, part of this is also, if you find someone that you enjoy working with, stick with them. You know, it's easy to work with people that are not great to work with in the film industry. So if you find like-minded people and like-minded creators, take them, keep them as your team, right? But anyway, so I was working a bit, sort of bouncing things around a bit with Noel, and then Damien Jones, who was the producer of Fast Girls, who's a producer of many other movies and a very established, great producer. I think he had the idea. It was coming up for the Olympics, and he said, "Oh, I think it would be good to do a kind of sports movie that is really a kind of classic sports movie in that, you know, you invest in these characters, they're underdog characters, and you end up cheering in your seat and clapping for their victory." And, you know, I think a good place to look is the sort of, he thought it would be a good idea to look at the sort of women's relay team as a kind of interesting. So I loved the idea. You know, he approached, I think, Noel, and Noel approached me, and I loved the idea because I always loved underdog movies. I love sports. I'm not a big sports guy, but I love, you know, from Rocky onwards, I love the story of characters fighting against the odds, characters being, you know, confronting, you know, finding many obstacles, being, you know, knocked down and getting back up again. To me, it's one of the sort of drama modes. It's one of the great sort of kind of dramatic journeys, is the journey of the underdog. And so I love those movies, and I'd wanted to work on a movie like that for a while. So I thought it was a great idea. And then Noel and I went and hung out with the athletes. We went and hung out with the women's relay team. And we were just really struck by the energy of these women and the energy of the whole atmosphere of the training camp. We went and hung out in the training camp, and I was really struck by, you know, there's this real kind of pressure cooker, hot house atmosphere. There's this real charged atmosphere. These are young people who spend their entire lives in their bodies training. And, you know, I was very interested by, you know, I remember the young women telling me, look, you know, we try and have girlfriends, we try and have boyfriends, and it's very hard to have a relationship with a civilian in this world because, you know, civilians don't understand what we go through as athletes, as professional athletes, or people who dedicate their lives, you know, they're training. I remember one of the athletes saying to me, "We are in pain every single day, you know, and we're dealing with the intensity of that." And there's this kind of real kind of like, you know, frisson because they're all because they can't have relationships, it's very hard for them to maintain relationships with people outside of that world. They're all having relationships with each other. They're all walking around with no clothes, hardly any clothes on all the time, you know, incredible physical, especially with men and women, right? So there was this real atmosphere. And what we learned too, which is now I think become common knowledge, is that the Olympic Village is like this party town, right? It's like for the athletes, they go wild, they go crazy because they've been in this very highly pressurized, very intense training experience for years, usually. And then they get to the Olympic Village and athletes can crash and burn and blow out their careers because they've been drinking too much the night before, or they're like, you know, everyone's sleeping with each other, and, you know, they're handing out bags of condoms because all the athletes want to sleep with each other. So we were really like, oh my God, there's this whole world here to the life of an athlete that's really interesting in terms of drama, in terms of, you know, talking about the reality for these women. And so that's what really drew us to that world. And Noel and I developed that film and had a great time doing it. And yeah, it became Fast Girls. And, you know, it was a fairly, I remember that by the time the film went into production, Noel got busy on something else. I got busy on something else. I think they brought in another great writer to do some work with the director. But it really, you know, turned into I mean, I'm very proud of that film. It turned into the film that I wanted it to be, which is a sports movie, you know, an underdog story that makes you shout and cheer when they win at the end and you get invested. That was really the ambition. I mean, often when I work on a project or start on a project, I have a sense of what I want the audience to feel. And I feel like what I wanted the audience to feel, they ended up hopefully feeling in that movie. So yeah, but it was a great experience. It was great working with Noah. It was great spending time with those athletes and understanding something about their lives. Yeah.
And from Fast Girls to The Girl in the Spiderweb, you seem to write a lot of strong women and female character leads, especially in kind of action films as well. Is that something that you consciously do and try and kind of rewrite like typically or stereotypically different genders in movies? And is that what you think about when you're casting as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's true that I have worked a lot on projects that have had female leads or strong female leads, and I don't have a great answer for that. I think it's not that I seek out those characters. There's certainly characters that I feel comfortable and enjoy writing, and I've thought about this. I mean, I've thought about why that seems to be the case. In the last 5 or 6 projects that I've worked on have all had female protagonists, really, and maybe one of the reasons, I mean, first of all, I would say that I think if you're writing, what writing I think is you're projecting into other minds and other worlds. That's what you do. I think there's no reason why, if you're serious about what writing is and serious about understanding the human condition, which is what I think writers do, there's no reason why a man can't write a great female part and a woman can't write a great male part, obviously. But I do think that probably for me, there is maybe something to do with the fact that I am drawn towards characters that often seem to be sort of at odds with the world in which they find themselves. The characters that have to assert their selfhood, assert their individuality against a world which, you know, seeks to undermine them or underestimate them. And maybe part of that for me is, you know, I myself, as I said, I'm a kind of mixed race brown kid who, you know, am part of the privileged male world, but also have always been an angle to that world. You know, I mean, you know, even going to Cambridge is a great example of that. You know, that I grew up in East London, and I found myself in a place of great, you know, white patriarchal privilege, and that's a negotiation. And now, you know, right now I'm working on a thing for Netflix that has 2 mixed race leads, and that's been that was a very important part of my pitch and a very important part of sort of why I was drawn to that project. So I think I'm drawn towards characters who are in some way outsiders, and I think often these women who are very strong women who have to assert themselves and have to assert their, you know, find their power, assert their power in a world that is seeking often to take it away is very interesting to me, and something that speaks to me as someone who kind of grew up a little bit outside the kind of mainstream, you know, power structure, let's call it. So maybe that's something to do with it. But it's certainly something that I think good writing should always seek to go beyond stereotypes. That when you're really, you know, even if you're writing the most kind of, you know, even if you're writing a character who seems to be, you know, the most vanilla character there is, what you need to bring to that always is a sense of specificity and a sense of humanity that is always about thinking beyond the kind of generic version of something. That's what always interests me. So yeah, obviously that was important to me in trying to work on Lisbeth Salander. I mean, Lisbeth Salander is such a great character already, you know, that it was really about trying to inhabit her world and inhabit her life. In fact, Lisbeth Salander, working on that script was the first time and the only time I've ever had because I wrote the first draft of that script in a very intensive period, quite quickly. And it was the first time, and I went a little bit mad writing that script. I went a bit insane. And I remember that I had this experience of Elizabeth like standing over my shoulder, this kind of dark figure of Elizabeth Salander in the room with me as I was writing. It's the only time I ever experienced. And I think it's because it's a testament to how strong that character is, just already as a character. But yeah, so, but that, you know, I think that's the best answer I can give to that question of why I'm drawn to these stories.
And with her as a character, what was it like working with, you know, Stieg Larsson's characters, but not necessarily having him there to discuss sWeb, and also having, I guess, maybe the added pressure of it already being a book? And did you want to stick closely to what had already been done with that character, or did you kind of want to forge your own path and kind of put your own stamp on her as a character?
You know, that project was really, you know, we were attempting, and it was Fede Alvarez, who's a good friend and collaborator, who directed that movie, and he brought me into that movie, and you know, he had a vision. I mean, part of what you're doing as a screenwriter is, you know, the best version of things is it's a collaboration with the director, but you're always trying to bring a vision to the screen, and often that vision is, the leader of that vision is the director, and Fede had a vision for that movie, which I think was a bold vision, which was to make a film really about Lisbeth, rather than make a film about Lisbeth and Blomqvist, was to make a film about Lisbeth and to differentiate from what had already been done with those movies. You know, to kind of pivot a little bit in genre, pivot a little bit in focus of those movies. You know, for better or for worse, some people loved that, some people didn't. But it was certainly a very kind of conscious decision that we made to do that, and you know, and I think it was an opportunity to bring Lisbeth sort of front and center in those stories, because even though you think about Lisbeth Salander in those books and in those movies, they're not really her stories. I mean, they're partly her stories, but they're often actually seen through the Blomqvist gaze, seen through the character of Blomqvist, and we were interested in sort of flipping it so that Blomqvist became the kind of person who was being the sort of peripheral character, and it was Elizabeth who was really driving the story. That was our ambition for that movie, yeah, in a creative sense.
And it worked really well. Soon we're going to have some questions from the audience, so please type your questions into the Q&A box somewhere down there and not the chat function, and we'll read them out. But while we're waiting, our final question for you is, do you have any TV or film recommendations to fill our lockdown summers?
Oh man, well, you know, I've been very fortunate, but also very slightly stressed because I've been very, very busy. So I took, you know, lots of work just as lockdown was starting. So I haven't watched much. And probably the things that I will talk about are things that you've all watched months and months ago. And so it's completely boring for me to say, but let me think. I mean, I just watched Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I don't know if people have seen Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I loved Portrait of a Lady. I thought it was a fantastic, poised, incredibly smart, incredibly well-made movie. I think it's good to watch Portrait of a Lady on Fire as an example of it's I suppose you would call it an art house movie. It's a drama, but it has a very, very strong premise. It's very almost classically strong premise. The idea of a woman, you know, in the 18th century who, you know, portraits were the sort of equivalent of the selfies of the era, the only way in which, you know, prospective husbands could, you know, approve of their prospective wives. And so again, you know, in themselves, these tools of sort of, you know, power, male power, but how a portrait painter is sent to paint the portrait of a woman who doesn't want her portrait painted, so that the, you know, prospective husband can approve of her, and then of course the portrait painter falls in love with her, and so there's and has to, but is painting this portrait secretly. It's just a great setup. That whole film flows from a very smart and almost classically sort of smart thriller premise. So I think it's a really good example of how good writing, you know, how the laws of good writing can apply to many, many different kinds of movies, not just giant Hollywood blockbusters. But I really enjoyed that. What else? Schitt's Creek. That's good. That's worth a binge if you want to laugh. What else? I just got up to date with I May Destroy You, which is pretty gut wrenching and great. And what I think is good about that, aside from the content and the, you know, and the kind of horribly smart way in which it kind of systematically takes away all your comfort, that show, which I think makes it so powerful. But it's also like, I think it's quietly we have a British TV program that sits up there with, you know, the good American TV programs in terms of its grammar, in terms of its visual language, its writing language, you know. it sits up there with Atlanta or whatever, like all of the good. And I think so there's suddenly been this evolution in British TV that's sort of happened that I've been waiting for, you know, and I think it's kind of happened, and I think that's one of the shows that has done it. So I think it's good news for British TV. But yeah, those are all very boring. I'm sure you've seen all of those things. Everyone's seen all those things. But look, I've just been writing, okay? I haven't had a chance to watch anything. You can probably give me better recommendations than I can give you.
No, they're great recommendations, and we've got your insights as a plus, so that's amazing. It kind of leads on to our first question, which I'm going to try and combine. So what do you think sort of the future of film and TV will be, either in sort of a post-corona age, or like, as you were talking about, having this sort of renaissance of British TV? And also another question, if you were starting out now and knowing what you know, would you do the same path or a different path? Yeah,
it's good questions. I think, well, nobody really knows is the answer to what is going to be the future. We certainly can see a shifting. Look, I mean, 2 projects I'm working on now are Netflix projects. I've never worked with Netflix before, but that is where just from a very practical point of view, that is where the employment is coming from, because the streamers are just rising in power and influence in our lives. I mean, everyone's watching Netflix, everyone's watching Hulu. You know, I worry that, you know, we're going to lose theatrical films more and more. I mean, what's certainly happened in the time that I've worked here, especially here in Hollywood, you know, the space for what used to be kind of mid-range dramatic movies, mid-range price, budget-wise, has really gone to the streamers, gone to TV. You know, theatrical movies are more and more giant event movies and franchise movies. You know, almost everything I end up working on or I'm approached to work on is either an existing IP or a franchise or a remake or a sequel. So I worry about cinema becoming narrower and narrower as we potentially lose cinema chains because of Corona, because of there are already cinema chains going out of business. But I do think streamers have brought a new level of freedom, and I think you can make things for the streamers that is very hard to make at a level and at a budget that's very hard to make for mainstream studios, the classical studios. So I do think, I mean, I'm talking about film here, I do think there's going to be increasingly an interesting space with the streamers. But, you know, how long that can sustain is unclear. I mean, Netflix, to give you some sort of insight, you know, Netflix right now, it's like the Wild West. They're paying ridiculous amounts of money. They're hoovering up content. People, you know, yes, people are getting to make their films, but then their films, unless they're lucky, their films can easily get lost in the great churn of Netflix. And so it's very hard to see that as a sustainable model, either for creators or on a business level, you know, because they're spending so much money. It's unclear whether they're actually making money yet, you know. So it feels like there's a kind of Wild West moment. I think that's going to level out. I don't know exactly what it's going to lead to. I will say that in the film, just from my point, from where I am in the industry, there's a very interesting thing that I think might grow, which is that I think there's a space. For example, it's happened in the horror genre, that there's a space now in the horror genre where actually very interesting filmmakers can make very interesting stories. But those stories, because they're within a genre, because they're within the horror genre, they are working as business models. They're working as films that can be made for pretty low budget, so 10 million and under, and they can, when they hit, make very good return. So I feel that there is this freedom in that space now, that I'm involved in that space too, where you can tell very interesting stories in a way that still can get you financed, and you can make a film that many people might see. And I wonder whether there will be a renaissance of these smaller, low budget, probably genre films that are testing the genre, that are stretching the genre and telling more interesting stories. And, you know, whether it's Us or whether it's Midsummer or whatever, those kind of movies. I wonder whether that will grow, that space might grow. I think that's a possible positive thing that might happen. But, you know, I don't know. I mean, none of us know what exactly the landscape is going to be like in the next couple of years. You know, we are in a state, we're definitely in a state of flux. I would say how it affects a writer breaking in. It does and it doesn't. I mean, it's still, what's going to break you in as a writer? Can you write great scripts? You know? And what tends to happen is if you write a great script, I mean, you shouldn't even be thinking, I think you shouldn't even be thinking, if you want to be a writer, if you want to build your career as a writer, it's slightly different if you're a writer-director. If you want to build your career as a writer, don't even think about whether that first great script that you write, or the first 5 scripts, by the way, that's the other thing. You have to write a great script, but then you have to write another one, you know, and then you have to write another one. Okay, so it's not about putting everything on one piece of work. But what will happen is you'll write a great script, and then the people who are holding the purse strings, the people who are essentially commissioning for their channels and their studios, will want to plug you into their world. They'll want to say, well, this is great, have a go at this. And that's really how, and on a very practical level, how a career in writing sort of progresses. So it really comes down to get good, write great stuff, write what you love, and give that to someone, you know, get that to someone who's going to see the quality of what you can do and then give you something else to do. I mean, that's still, that journey is still the same. In terms of would I do it differently now? I think for sure, you know, any writer starting out now is going to inevitably think about television much more than I thought about television. You know, I think that there are different, I do think that there are people like me, the church that I worship at is really film. You know, that was my first love. And so I think more in terms of film. But if I was starting out now, there's so much good stuff happening in television. There's so much more employment. Film employment has just contracted, right? Television employment has grown. And there's so much more freedom and so much more good stuff in TV that you would be crazy not to think about, you know, as a writer, to think about television projects and what you would do in TV, and perhaps working on sample pilot scripts and so on. So I definitely think that's a big change. You know, I didn't have to think about TV because there wasn't really that avenue wasn't even really there in the same way when I was coming up. And now, you know, I am, you know, involved. I've been involved in developing a couple of TV projects and so on. I mean, I'm lucky enough from my point of view that my career is, you know, it has grown in film, and that's what I love to do. And I'm able to, you know, work in film, and that's what employs me. But yeah, I mean, I think for any young writer, you know, you're going to inevitably be thinking about television now in a way that I didn't. But I think the same rules apply, as you still got to get good. You know, you've got to, and you're still going to write what you love, and you're still going to really write from that place, rather than writing something that you think you need to write because that's what people are interested in. My advice would still be the same.
Thank you.
And yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. And just as a final question to end on, lots of your work seems to have kind of big emotional scenes where there's often not much dialogue. Like in Song of Songs, I think there's, you know, lots of very emotional moments where there's not much speech happening. How do you go about writing that when, you know, there's not as many words to put on the page? And also kind of joined with that question, you also use Hebrew in Song of Songs, and for, you know, I imagine for much of an English-speaking audience, that's kind of going to fall on deaf ears. So how do you work with that in a script, knowing that people might not understand word for word, but, you know, working with tone and etc.?
Sure. Okay, I'm so distracted by this Hebrew question that I've forgotten the first part. Oh, dialogue and action. Okay. Look, I think it's a common misconception that screenplay is about dialogue. In fact, I would say most of screenplay is nothing to do with dialogue. You have to get good at writing dialogue, and you know, there's a whole separate talk we could have about what makes for good dialogue. But what you're doing when you're writing a screenplay really is you're you're writing a blueprint for the movie. And so, and what you need to do as well is you need to write it in such a way as when you read that screenplay, the reader sees the movie in their mind. That's a good screenplay. That you're directing the movie on the page for the reader. And it's often said that you shouldn't direct on the page, and that's complete nonsense. Like every great screenwriter directs the movie for the reader. And so much of that is about silence. So much of that is about visual information. It's about action. And so really, you know, I would say much more important than understanding dialogue, although understanding and being able to write good dialogue is very, very important. But more important than that is understanding structure. It's understanding how to tell a story. And so for me, some of my favorite scenes are scenes without dialogue, because all you have to tell the story is the image. You have action and image. And so part of what you're doing when you're writing screenplays is trying to understand how to express the story with no internal monologue, no internal narrative, and simply through images. And so that to me is pure cinema. That's purely what cinema can do that other mediums can't. And so, you know, it really comes down to understanding the structure of your scene and understanding the structure of your story and what you're trying to express in that scene. And, you know, the least dialogue for me, sometimes the better, you know, because what a movie can do is express so much in the tension of a look or, you know, an action sequence. I mean, I love action. Part of the reason why I love action movies, good action movies, is to me that is purely what cinema can do. You know, there's no other medium that can do that. And so I would say if you're learning the ropes of screenplay, what you should be learning more than anything is how to express a story through visual information. The dialogue is really just the dialogue is often just a kind of facilitator, a tool, an extra tool that you can use. Obviously, there are certain writers, that are very dialogue driven, you know, and have a real touch with dialogue. And you know, I'm thinking of Aaron Sorkin, or they're often playwrights who also work as screenwriters, but or Tarantino or someone like that. But without understanding of structure, without understanding of pure simply visual information and action, they would be stage plays. They wouldn't be movies. So, you know, I would say think about can you tell your story with no dialogue, you know? And because it's a very interesting, it's a very helpful, it's often a very helpful kind of approach, because then you can think, well, what dialogue do I need? You know, screenwriting is the art of the necessary, really. You know, what dialogue, what words do I really need? And that can drive your choices in dialogue. You know, what's really necessary. The more that you can do with visual information, I think better. So does that answer your question? Oh yeah, and Hebrew. Yeah. Well, Hebrew, you know, for that movie, the Hebrew was necessary, and it was part of the world of the movie. And for us, I think I can't even remember the Hebrew parts very well, but I think the choices that we made were, what was more important was the understanding that Hebrew was being used than the kind of content, understand the content of those words. The words have a kind of ritual power in that movie. But in general, look, I mean, I'm working on a TV project now, which is with an Indian director and showrunner called Vikram Motwain, who made a great series called Sacred Games. And that will be half in Hindi. And so we're thinking about, but of course it will be subtitled Hindi. But we're thinking about, you know, and more than ever, I think with the streamers and Netflix, there's an interest in stories that can talk to many cultures and talk to many people at the same time. And that's a great and exciting challenge, to be able to make a story that works in different languages. And, you know, you think about the balance, you think about what is the kind of attention, what is the kind of patience, the kind of level of patience and the level of understanding that a non-Hindi speaker would have of those sections. But it really just should flow from story. I mean, I think those decisions, when they're best, those decisions of like, are you going to flip to another language? If they flow organically from story and there's a strong reason for them, then most of the time they're going to work, you know. obviously on a studio movie, you have certain, because of, you know, you're trying to appeal to the biggest audience possible, you have certain things that you have to think about of like, well, you know, is there a way of expressing this that means you don't have to sit and listen to a language you don't understand for 15 minutes? And usually the answer is yes, there is, you know. But I think it all should flow from story. That's always the best aesthetic choice. If it flows organically from the demands of the story, then don't be afraid to flip into other languages and, you know, use those tools.
Perfect words to end on. Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for your wonderful answers and for giving us your time. And thank you to everyone else who joined the call and asked amazing questions. Please like our Facebook page for more updates. And thank you so much for supporting us on our first series. We're now having a break for summer, but we will be back in September for next term series. And thank you again, Jay, for giving us your time and your incredible answers. It was a masterclass.
Well, I hope it was helpful. I hope everyone stays well, and yeah, good, happy writing, happy filmmaking. Go do it. Go make something.